Well, this is quite a scene. I don't think I've ever lectured in such a place, such a beautiful place. I'm so happy to be here and not in sweltering St. Petersburg, I must say, as much as I love that place. This is my first visit to Chautauqua, and I have to tell you, I consider it an honor, really and a privilege to be here under the sponsorship of the African American Heritage House, and especially to have the opportunity to speak about the extraordinary life of John Lewis, the civil rights icon. You know, I've been speaking on John almost nonstop since the book came out in January in any number of venues. Nothing like this, I must say. This is, I think, the high point. I consider speaking here at Chautauqua to be really a pinnacle. To me, just being here for 24 hours, it seems to be a place that celebrates the beloved community, the ideal that John Lewis devoted his life to. It's nice to have at least a taste of it, because it's often dismissed as a utopian ideal, that it really can't exist in the real world. But I think you're coming about as close as I've seen. And I know John Lewis spoke here once. I'm not sure if any of you were here. Anybody here when he spoke? I don't know how long ago it was. In fact, maybe I should ask, how many of you had the good fortune of meeting John Lewis? Wow. Oh, that's impressive. I always like to know how much information the audience has before I start speaking. And in fact, a number of years ago, I was at a conference at the Smithsonian on Native American history, and there was a woman scholar, Mary Beth Norton, who was a distinguished scholar at Cornell. But she really wasn't an expert on Native American history, and she was very nervous about speaking to this gathering, which has some of the leading Native American historians in the country. So she told this story, which I've repeated on several occasions, and I actually had the chance to meet Mary Beth again a couple of years ago, and I told her, I thanked her for this story, and she had no memory of saying this story at all. So maybe I just made it up, I don't know. But it's a story about a historian who died in the 1889 Johnstown, Pennsylvania flood. Terrible disaster, and he goes up to heaven, and he's checking in with St. Peter, and all he wants to talk about is the flood, the raging waters, the damage, you know, on and on and on. And St. Peter's just trying to get him checked in. But he won't stop. He keeps talking about the flood. And finally he says, you know, I could give a lecture on the flood. And I really want to give a lecture on the flood. And finally, St. Peter says, okay, we'll let you give the lecture, but I have to warn you, Noah will be in the audience, okay? So I see a few Noahs out there, so to keep me honest. This book on John Lewis meant a great deal to me. He was a personal friend. We had a friendship for 20 years, beginning in 2000 when I was researching my book on the Freedom Rides, and he was one of my first interviewees and was so kind to me. At the time, he was organizing the 40th reunion of the Freedom Rides, which occurred in 1961, as I'm sure most of you know. And he was trying to find all these former Freedom Riders, there were 436 of them, to invite them to this reunion. And of course, I had been writing this book, and I had spent a lot of time finding these people. So I had all these addresses, and so we put our heads together, and he sort of asked me to sort of help him organize this reunion, and sort of made me an honorary Freedom Rider, which I must say was the greatest thing that anybody ever did for me, because it opened up a whole world a new world of understanding about what the civil rights movement was all about. And it took me 8 years to finish that book, in part because there were 436 Freedom Riders. You know, some of you the original Freedom Ride, organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, had 13 Freedom Riders, and John was one of them. There were 7 blacks and 6 whites. But that freedom ride was obstructed, let's say, by Klan violence in Alabama, and they never made it to New Orleans. The idea was a 2-week trip to New Orleans to arrive on May 17th, the anniversary of the Brown decision, 7th anniversary, but they never made it past Birmingham, and they had to fly to New Orleans, and it was considered a great failure on their part. Many of them had never been in the Deep South before. They didn't know quite what they were up against. Of course, John had, growing up in Pike County, Alabama, but they were sort of rescued by a student group that John belonged to, the Nashville student movement, and which reinforced them in a sense. Much to the consternation of the Kennedy administration, they thought their freedom rides were over, right? These people had given up and they'd flown to New Orleans, and then here's 21 more kids willing to risk their lives to come into Birmingham to try to sort of stand up for justice, for racial justice. Anyway, it was a much more complicated project than I had anticipated. I knew about the original 13. I knew there were a few others. I didn't know there were more than 60 freedom rides in 1961. And so it was an elaborate process to find these people who, some of them had kept in contact, but most of them had not. And so anyway, John and I kind of cooperated together, and that began a real friendship, which I treasure, which of course complicated writing his biography. You know, you want a certain level of detachment when you're writing a biography, and it's hard to be detached about John Lewis. You know, when he was elected to Congress in 1986, and the New York Times was previewing all the new congressmen, they said John was the only one who had the saint problem. Everyone thought he was a saint. And I have to tell you, after spending so many years with him in this book, I couldn't argue with that, really. You know, I wanted to present him as a flesh and blood human being with all his faults. I couldn't find very many, I can tell you. You know, he's really not like the rest of us, frankly. I never met anyone in my lifetime who was anything like him. You know, he was almost otherworldly in his lack of ego, his lack of pretense, his sense of compassion and desire for reconciliation. He really lived a life of the beloved community, which was a concept which animated his entire life. And I had done studies like this before. Really, this is the fourth in a quartet of books. I did Freedom Riders. Then I did a shorter book on Marian Anderson, who also spoke here in 1957. But I was writing about her famous concert in 1939 when the DAR would not allow her to sing in Constitution Hall. Eleanor Roosevelt and others intervened and created a kind of a movement, interracial movement, and she was able to sing at the Lincoln Memorial. It was the first large gathering ever, long before Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech in the March on Washington in 1963. 75,000 people showed up, and black and white, and it was a kind of a moment where America could see its potential, what it could be. It wasn't. You know, in fact, that night after her incredible concert, there was no hotel in Washington would let she and her mother stay. So they ended up staying at a senator's house. The reality of the situation. And then I did a book on Arthur Ashe, who's kind of a John Lewis type figure. Great tennis player, but also an extraordinary humanitarian and incredible bravery throughout his life. And finally, this book on John, which I think maybe means more to me than any of the others. I mean, it's been a wonderful journey, but knowing John so well, and I felt a sense of responsibility in writing the book to try as best I could to bring out the unique character of his life. I really see him as one of the greatest Americans of the 20th century and 21st century, really, until he died in 2020. The trajectory of his life, you know, from utter poverty in Pike County, no electricity, no running water, right, no paved roads. The family were sharecroppers. He was one of 10 children. It's miraculous to think from there where he ended up. And it's really a testament to his iron will. I mean, he was famous for being incredibly congenial and friendly, and some people, I think, took him as being sort of soft. Well, there's nothing soft about John Lewis, I can tell you. He had fire in his belly, and to be able to do the things that he did is truly, truly remarkable. I'd actually like to begin with a story and a metaphor, if I can. The story is about the most memorable moment that I had with John in our 20-year friendship. And it's a story about his friendship with an ex-Klansman named Elwyn Wilson from Rock Hill, South Carolina. In 1961, the Freedom Rides had a fairly easy first week of it in the Upper South, in Virginia and North Carolina. Nobody tried to kill them, at least, as they did in Alabama. But they got to Rock Hill on the 7th day, and they were met at the bus station in Rock Hill, which was kind of a tough town, notorious for a large clan clavern. And well, about a dozen of these Klansmen showed up and started beating John and two of the other Freedom Riders before they could even walk into the station and try to break the law, or break the local law, of course. And one of them was Elwyn Wilson. He was 24 years old. He was kind of a Klansman in training. You know, he as he said later, you know, I didn't know anything at that age. I was just a hooligan, and he always felt bad. John was pretty badly hurt. This was the first of, well, he lost count of the number of beatings in his life. He had at least 45 beatings. Okay, some of them ended up with, you know, he had concussions, fractured skull. In the later years, when he lost all of his hair, you could see, if you got close to him, all the marks all through his head where he'd been hit with various objects. And he also was incarcerated 45 times in his life. 5 times as a congressman. He was very proud of that, actually. He didn't stop, even though he was a member of Congress. Well, with Mr. Wilson, went on with his life. He got religion, he got married, had children, left the Klan, and always felt guilty about what he had done to John Lewis back in 1961. So fast forward to 2009, and Barack Obama, his first inauguration. Some of you may remember watching it, or maybe some of you were there. John was sitting right in the front. You could see him, big as life, behind Barack Obama. And Mr. Wilson was watching it, and it sort of spurred him impulsively to call John's office. And he actually gets a hold of John, which was not unusual, actually. I mean, he had no sense of having a team that shielded him from the real world. He felt as part of that. Like, you know, he thought of himself as a kind of one of the foot soldiers of the movement. He never really sought leadership, even though it came to him. So John gets on the phone, and Mr. Wilson is crying into the phone and sobbing and saying, "I'm so sorry what I did to you. Will you please forgive me?" Well, of course, this is John Lewis, all about forgiveness. Of course, he forgives him. They're praying over the phone. They're crying over the phone. And I think with most people, that would have been the end of it, but not with John Lewis. So he invites Mr. Wilson up to Washington to have a come-to-Jesus meeting in John's office. Paid for everything, of course. And in a very emotional meeting, they became friends. And John not only forgave him, but really could see the goodness in this man. So 2011, 2 years later, it was the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides. The film based on my book had come out and got all this attention. It's now been seen by more than 60 million people across the world. And Oprah saw it. They sent her a DVD copy. And she calls the filmmaker sobbing into the phone, saying, I had no idea the Freedom Rides was like this, that it was so important. I only have 4 shows left. She was closing out her show. I've got to devote one of them to the Freedom Rides. So she flew in every living Freedom Rider and their family. It was in May of 2011. So she really did an incredible job, I think, of preparation, and her producers talked to me and others about, well, can you find a reconciliation story? They thought it might be too dark a subject for Oprah. So even though the Freedom Rides end successfully and desegregate transportation, but they wanted a reconciliation story. Have you got a reformed Klansman for us? You know, we can bring on the show. Oh, so we said, well, actually we do. We have Elwyn Wilson. At this point, he was very frail. You know, he's in his 70s. He died about 2 years later. And, but he agreed to come on the show. He was terrified, you know, of course. Surrounded by 180 Freedom Riders. He was kind of the designated villain, you know, of the piece. So we're all in the Harp studio there in Chicago. And so John is sitting here, and Mr. Wilson's on his other side, and I'm on this side, right next to John, but I'm off camera. But I could see everything that was happening. So Oprah asked her first question of Mr. Wilson. Nothing comes out. He's just, you could see he was just going to bolt the stage. He was just terrified, about to implode. So she tries another question, and again, nothing. And I really thought he was going to just bolt off the stage in terror. John, somehow impulsively, he reaches out with his left hand and he grabs Mr. Wilson's right hand. And in a voice that everybody could hear in the studio, he says, "He's my brother." You know, it was such an act of compassion. I mean, it was really kind of a symbolic of a beloved community, really. As John once says, you'll know you're getting close to the beloved community when you can love your enemies as much as you love your friends. Martin Luther King often said that, you know, that you may dislike what they do, you might not like them, but if you love them as a human being and sort of admit them into the kind of the circle of humanity on an equal basis, then you're getting close to the beloved community. But he did that day, and I'll never forget it. You know, people were crying all over the studio. You know, it's just, and you can it's on YouTube. You can see it. You can see it now today. What happened with Mr. Wilson. But to me, that'll always be the quintessential John Lewis that day with Mr. Wilson. A second thing I'd like to say before I talk more about the details of John and the movement. When I was in graduate school, one of my mentors came up with a metaphor, really, to describe the difference between the humanities and the social sciences. He considers himself a humanities scholar, so maybe it's not entirely fair, but he used the metaphor of packing for a trip. A man, it was gendered, sorry, but the man's packing for a trip, and it's a week long, and he's stuffing all of his clothes into the suitcase, and it doesn't fit. So he takes them out and he puts them back in, and he's sort of jumping on the suitcase, and finally he gets the suitcase closed. But there's a necktie hanging out, okay? The proverbial dangling necktie. Well, if you're a social scientist, you can just go and cut that necktie off, right? You may lose a necktie, but you're more interested in what's inside the suitcase than what's outside. You're trying to build models of behavior. You're trying to make generalizations. A historian can't cut the necktie off, right? That necktie may be Adolf Hitler. It may be John Lewis, someone who doesn't fit any pattern, is not really representative of anything, but can have an extraordinary impact on history, as certainly John did. So I often thought about that, about John as the necktie. And the more I got into the project, the more I realized how truly different he was from almost anyone else that I had studied. You know, again, his life story, coming out of Pike County, sharecropper's son, one of 10 children, just utter poverty. No reason to believe that he could ever go beyond the county line. He'd hardly ever left his village before he was 10 years old. I've been there now and met with his brothers and family, and now I understand, I think, better about what he came from. He claims that part of the inspiration to become a civil rights leader, to embrace the wider world, was that he didn't like farm work. You know, his brothers and sisters always complained that when there was work to be done in the field, you couldn't find him. He was reading a book somewhere. He was a voracious reader from the time he was a young boy. He was the first person in his family to graduate from high school, you know, and he always had his head in a book. And later, of course, he collected first editions. He was very, very intelligent and very well educated. The conversations we had, and he communicated with some of the top minds of our age. One thing that he did was, you may have heard the chicken story, famous chicken story. He didn't like to chop cotton. He didn't like to be out in the field, so they gave him the chickens when he was 6 years old. 60 chickens. They were his responsibility. The other kids hated these chickens. They were dirty and noisy, but he loved the chickens. And he wanted to be a preacher at that time, so he sort of preached to these chickens. In his autobiography, Walking with the Wind, which was published in 1998, was a New York Times bestseller. He talks a lot about the chickens and how he thought they really listened to him. They really sort of stood up when he created these sermons, and he really loved them. And I think in some ways you can sort of see the depth of his humanity in the way that he could identify with them. But he had a kind of streak in him early on, where he was rough cut. You know, he was a country boy, as he often said, particularly when he ran against Julian Bond, his great friend, for Congress in 1986. And of course, Julian was kind of a prince. You know, he was extraordinary, good-looking and smooth and slick. And John was none of those things. He knew it. And he liked to say, "I'm not a showboat, I'm a tugboat. I'm not a showboat, I'm a tugboat." And I think that sort of captures him. His first protest actually was in 1956. He's 16 years old, and he loved to read, and he couldn't get the books, and so he goes to the Troy Public Library, which of course was Jim Crow. Everything was cradle-to-grave segregation in Alabama in those days. And Montgomery bus boycott was going on, and he was kind of inspired by that. And so he went to the library and tried to get a library card. Of course, they threw him out on his ear. But he didn't let that stop him. He went and did a petition drive. We wrote up this petition that they have to have a kind of racially non-exclusionary library, right? What a thing to ask for, right? And he went back to his classmates, of course, an all-black school, trying to get them to sign the petition. And the vast majority would not sign it. They were terrified, really. There were a lot of things happening in the mid-50s. The Klan was reemerging, the White Citizens Council, people were being lynched and brutalized, and he got a couple of his cousins to sign the petition, but you know, he wasn't able to desegregate the library. Years later, 1998, Walking with the Wind comes out. It's a top bestseller with the New York Times. The Troy Library invites him as an honored guest, right, a speaker. So he comes to the Troy Library, which of course was integrated by then. You know, this is 1998. And the first thing he said, "I want my library card. I'm not leaving till I get my library card." And the same thing was true with Troy University, used to be known as Troy State. When he went to an all-black seminary in Tennessee when he was 17, and he was dissatisfied that there was no real social gospel orientation at that. He tried to organize a NAACP branch. He met with the president and said, "You just can't do that. We were being funded by white Methodists, you know, and you just can't do that." And so he was really crushed, and he thought, well, maybe this is not the place for me. Nobody wants to talk about the social gospel. He thought about applying to Troy. And he wrote a letter to Martin Luther King saying, "Will you help me? Will you back me in this?" And of course, so here he is in 1957, at the age of 17, meeting with Martin Luther King in Montgomery and Ralph Abernathy and the whole Southern Christian Leadership Conference group. And King, that's when King dubbed him the boy from Troy, okay, the boy from Troy. He wasn't really actually from Troy. Troy was about 10 miles away and could have been 100 miles away in terms of the lifestyle that he lived. And of course, King agreed to back him, but he said, "You need to check with your parents." And of course, he did, and the parents reluctantly agreed that they'd support him and let him apply to try to break the segregation barrier at Troy Well, they agreed for 24 hours. And the next day they came to him and said, look, John, we just can't do this. You've got 9 brothers and sisters. You'll put all of us at risk. You know, we may lose our farm. We may lose everything. We may lose our lives, which was not an exaggeration in those days. And so he went back to American Baptist Theological Seminary for the rest of his undergraduate life. And it's good that he did, because in 1958, a man named Jim Lawson, some of you may know about Jim Lawson. He died in June at the age of 95. Within the movement, he's as revered as anyone, as revered as John, as revered as Martin Luther King. He was probably the leading Gandhian intellectual in the United States, originally from Ohio, born in Pennsylvania actually, but went to Baldwin Wallace College. And in 1958, King encouraged him to drop out of divinity school and come to Tennessee, to Nashville, and start holding nonviolent workshops. So that's what he did. And he kind of created a whole local movement. The sit-ins were just beginning, of course, soon after that. And he trained John and many others in this spirit of nonviolent direct action. And I got to know Jim pretty well, and I always wondered, what hold did he have over these kids, you know, that had really no background in this. And he had a kind of quiet charisma that was, it's almost impossible to describe. I was with him once in Los Angeles. They had issued a postage stamp in honor of the Freedom Riders. And so they had a bunch of Freedom Riders there, and every politician imaginable in Southern California was there. They wanted a piece of the action. Of course, they were nowhere around in 1961, but here it is, you know, 2005, and they all want to identify with these freedom fighters. And so they all gave long talks, including the mayor, and had a big, nice lunch, and then there were only 10 minutes left. And they thought Jim Lawson would just give a 10-minute speech. Okay, well, no way. So he gets up and he says, I want you to lock the doors, okay? I don't want anybody to leave. And he proceeded to give this speech that, I mean, the paint was coming off the walls, frankly, talking about the relationship between civil rights and human rights and immigrants' rights. That was his big issue at that point. And I've never forgotten it. Just a man that made you want to follow him. Extraordinary. Just an extraordinary man. And he had a huge influence on John Lewis. He and Dr. King, of course. And Jim was always there as a kind of mentor for those younger kids who went out, became freedom riders, and risked their lives. You know, these are 19, 20-year-old kids who knew they might not come back. They would write their last will and testament before they got on the bus. Their parents told them not to do it. Their teachers, their ministers said, you're crazy, you're just going to get yourself killed. You're not going to prove anything except that the Deep South is not ready for nonviolent direct action. And they said, well, maybe so, but if we get killed, others will follow. I mean, they were absolutely determined, and they had a sense about themselves. I know John had it, that if he died, he died. You know, he was willing to die for his principles. In fact, of the 436 Freedom Riders, more than 300 of them ended up in Parchman Prison, the prison farm in Mississippi, which Faulkner dubbed Destination Doom. Okay, a place you don't want to go. And the political leaders in Mississippi and the Kennedy administration figured, well, this will end the Freedom Rides. We put them in that prison, not just a jail, but a real prison. And they'll go crying home to their mothers. Well, they didn't. They turned Parchman Prison into a kind of university of nonviolence. They started singing more and more freedom songs, driving the jailers crazy. You know, and they kept saying, well, how can you people be so happy? You know, we're abusing you, you know. But in a sense, they had absorbed this spirit of what Gandhi called unmerited suffering. That's a way to kind of enlightenment. If you suffer unmerited suffering, you sort of get your stripes as a freedom fighter. And that's what happened there. And all those people who were in Parchman Prison and who survived it became the leaders of the movement for the rest of the decade, really. I mean, all the later things, from Birmingham to St. Augustine, you know, to everything that happened. Freedom Summer in 1964, of course, we're now celebrating the 60th anniversary of that, and the Civil Rights Act. It's kind of an interesting moment here for us. But anyway, there was a depth of their commitment which was not truly rational. They had no reason to believe they could pull it off, that they could actually desegregate the buses. They didn't have any money. They didn't have really powerful friends. I mean, a lot of people gave money to try to help them, but somehow they did. And that sort of broke the mystique of Jim Crow. There was a sense among the movement that, well, you don't go in to Southwest Mississippi. That's just suicide. You don't go into Selma, Alabama. Right? In fact, in Selma, Bernard Lafayette, who was John's best friend and roommate, he came back from raising money in Chicago for the movement, and all the other student nonviolent coordinating committee places were taken. And they had a big map where they were sending people for voting rights work, and they had Selma with a big X over it. And he said, well, why is there an X over it? Selma, he said, well, you have to be crazy to go to try to register people to vote in Selma. Bernard says, I'll take it. I'll take it. And he's the one who started the movement there, which of course led to the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965 and the Voting Rights Act, and American history changed that summer of '65, and John was a big part of it. Maybe the seminal experience of his life was what he later called Bloody Sunday. Maybe you're familiar with that. It was they were going to march from Selma to Montgomery, 52 miles, and there was an injunction against them by a local judge. And Martin Luther King had to decide whether to obey the injunction, at least temporarily, or have people march and lose the Kennedy administration's support. And so it was a very difficult situation. Well, John and Hosea Williams, who was from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, decided, well, we're going to lead 600 people over Edmund Pettus Bridge to start the march. And they get to the top of the bridge, and they can see down below all these mounted horsemen, possemen, state police, all heavily armed, waiting for them. And they get to the top of the bridge, and Hosea turns to John and he says, "Can you swim?" And John says, "No." And Hosea says, "I can't either." So they gritted their teeth and went down, and John was nearly killed that day, fractured skull. And so when the actual Selma to Montgomery March started 2 weeks later, he was still in the hospital. The doctors made him agree he could march during the day, 5 or 6 miles or more, and then then they'd bring him back to the hospital in Selma at night, and then he'd go back the next day. And he did that all the way to Montgomery, and gave one of the great speeches of his life there on the steps of the Montgomery, the Alabama state capitol, with George Wallace looking through the windows, kind of saying, "Who are these people? What is happening to the world?" There were 30,000 people there who had made the march. And so John spent a lot of the rest of his life recreating that day, that movement, that victory in Selma. I was very fortunate this year to be part of a Faith and Politics pilgrimage, which John organized, and it's been going on for years and years and years, where he takes about 20 congressmen, including a few Republicans, reluctly, who would agree to come, and they would go to all these civil rights sites, which I've taken students to for years, and it was always a very moving thing when John would get on the bridge, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I urge all of you who haven't been there, it's a mystical experience to be there. It's just like the world that time forgot. But the things that happened there changed all of our lives. And of course, this is just the civil rights stage. I mean, in 1965, Bayard Rustin, the great Gandhian intellectual who helped organize the March on Washington and the earlier March on Washington with A. Philip Randolph in 1941, he wrote an article in 1965 called "From Protest to Politics." And what he was saying is that it's time for us to make that change from protest to politics, to start getting elected. And I don't think at that point John ever thought he'd be the one, because not too many of those protest leaders could make that transition from fighting the struggles in the streets to the halls of Congress. But John did, with incredible effect, served 17 terms. He'd still be serving if he hadn't gotten pancreatic cancer and died at the age of 80. And I think those of us who knew him miss him every day, because I don't know that we're ever going to find anyone quite up to the task of replacing him. I mean, there's some great figures, and he's left a tremendous legacy, but it's not easy to live up to those standards. I think it's hopefully his memory won't die, and he'll continue to inspire us in death as he did in life. Thank you.